Due Process, winner of 12 New York and Mid-Atlantic Emmys, including the 2008 award for Best Discussion Series.
We know the challenges that tomorrow will bring are the greatest of our lifetime. 2 wars, a planet in peril, the worst financial crisis in a century.
2 wars and a recession. Perhaps the greatest challenges facing this new president, but not the only ones. He's promised change, but when it comes to justice issues, what will that mean? An Obama insider and a former justice of the state Supreme Court weigh in. Up next on Due Process.
Major funding for Due Process provided by the New Jersey State Bar Foundation, committed to educating the public about the law, and by the Fund for New Jersey, supporting informed citizens for an effective democracy.
A new tenant in the White House always means some change, but when there's a shift of party and a president elected on a platform of change, we know change is likely to be more than in the trappings. I'm Raymond Brown.
And I'm Sandra King. And for us at Due Process, the question becomes, what will that change mean to the justice issues we follow here each week? So our topic today, not the war or the economy, those overriding issues that monopolize the front pages, but the justice concerns with which the new president will also have to cope.
And so we welcome 2 uniquely qualified guests, one from each party, both well-versed in the ways of public policy, politics, and the law. Peter Vernieros, now back to practicing law, but he was Christie Whitman's Attorney General and later a Justice of the New Jersey Supreme Court. And with us from Newark, Seton Hall Law Professor Mark Alexander, an Obama policy aide, New Jersey State Director of the campaign, and a member of the Obama transition team.
Welcome to you both. And Mark, let me start with you in Newark. New president, new priorities on the justice issues, on the legal issues. There are so many that he might choose to focus on. What do you see as the top 5 priorities?
Top 5 priorities. Well, first, we've got a Justice Department that has to be repaired. The last years of President Bush, the Justice Department has fallen to a place where the law has been politicized so terribly. So there's got to be leadership from the top to fundamentally change the way justice moves forward.
Let me rephrase the question,
Sure.
Given the fact that you've brought up a question that we want to pursue in greater depth. Let's drop the next 4. Let's talk more about the Justice Department.
Sure. Well, I think also that the change at the top and the fundamental leadership of the Justice Department is going to affect all the things that follow from it. But right now what we need to see is a Justice Department that's committed to fair and full enforcement of the law regardless of politics. So the scandals we've seen in the past with the way the Justice Department has been run will need to change, and I think Barack Obama as president is going to really do a lot to help us with that.
Peter, let me follow up with you a little bit. I want to call you Justice, I want to call you Peter, because both are true. You're a friend and also a retired justice. But one of the things that continues to bubble up are evidence of continued political decisions made at the highest levels of the Justice Department, something that was also covered in hearings in the Gonzalez case. How deep did that go, and is that something that needs to be addressed directly, as Professor Alexander has suggested, or can the new administration merely put in place people who act properly and move on?
Well, I think whenever the Inspector General of the Justice Department finds wrongdoing, he or she ought to disclose it and prepare reports and do the kinds of inquiries that they are apparently doing on an internal basis. I agree with that. I also agree with Professor Alexander that we obviously should have a fair and impartial Justice Department. So anything that the new administration can do to restore morale and restore confidence in the Justice Department, it would certainly be a good thing. That said, I am impressed by something that the President said not too long ago, that he was not going to spend a disproportionate amount of his time or energy simply replaying the past and endlessly investigating the prior administration. I think he has to find the right balance there. I think he very much wants to turn the page and really start fresh. That's what he campaigned on, and it appears that that's what he's likely to do.
Now, that could play out differently in different areas. For example, the subject matter of whether or not people from the Federalist Society had a priority in Justice Department jobs could probably be resolved with less controversy by a new administration that stops the practice. On the other hand, the question of torture and whether fundamental violations of human rights took place at the hands of this administration in response to the war on terror is probably a more controversial area where the president will have to make a decision about whether to look backwards, as it is said, or to investigate.
It will be controversial. It also will be very difficult. Those issues are terribly complex. We've had the United States Supreme Court, in a series of rulings, be very divided among the justices as to exactly what the rights of detainees are, what procedures ought to be followed, and so forth.
But they've never okayed torture if that took place. And in fact, one could argue in those series of opinions they have slapped the Bush administration on basic questions involving habeas and humanitarian law. So in that sense, there is, at least this administration has argued, the new one, President Obama, a new change and a new sheriff in town. The question is, are there going to be some consequences and a serious revisiting of that?
Well, the issue will be, in terms of Bush appointees, what do they believe was lawful at the time, and were their judgments reasonable, even if in hindsight they are proven to be mistaken. Now, let me be clear, I am not sanctioning illegal conduct. I'm not saying that anyone who clearly and inexcusably violated the law should be given a pass. All I'm saying is the issues are very complicated.
Professor Alexander, would you say that that is the standard, whether someone thought that they were acting lawfully, and particularly when it comes to torture, to interrogation and detention? Do you think it's disingenuous for people who okayed, say, waterboarding to say, thought it was fine?
Yeah, I think we have to probe deeply into what people are thinking and what their perspective is on this and what they were doing at the time, because there certainly are arguments about what methods of interrogation are appropriate and which are inappropriate, but there are some things which are clearly beyond the pale. And that kind of investigation is necessary, but also I think that Justice Vernero makes an important point that is very important to where Barack Obama will lead as president. We have to fundamentally change the direction we've gone in. And in order to do that, we're going to have to see that the president takes steps to say that he's going to shut down Guantanamo, change policies that were put in place erroneously that justify torture and other methods like that, and say, what is the new direction we're going to go in? So we're going to have to deal with some and look at what happened in the past, no doubt, but most important really is looking to the future and saying new policy must go forward with a much more appropriate focus that really respects human rights.
But how far would you see this administration going in trying to hold Bush officials responsible for the interrogation, the detention questions that you're saying were beyond the pale?
Yeah, I think that that's honestly going to be a decision that's going to be made on a case-by-case basis to see who is doing what and authorizing what kinds of means. And indeed, that's going to be a decision, frankly, for the president. Excuse me?
Prosecution?
Depending on what the facts reveal. I certainly won't speculate as to what the facts reveal about what people knew.
An independent commission? How does one go about this?
Well, I think that the Attorney General is going to have to find a way to have an independent investigation of what did happen. But again, the key here is not to let that detract from doing the business of moving forward with more appropriate policies. So while the investigation of what happened may indeed occur, what has to happen fundamentally is we have to say, as a nation, we are moving forward because we have been in a place we shouldn't have been, and we are going to change our policy and move forward in a productive way, respect the rule of law.
Because this is so vital, let me just do one bit of follow-up. We've had Michael Chertoff on the last couple of weeks talking about critical questions, and his position is once President Obama really has to take the reins himself and make judgments, his perspective will be different. On the other hand, there are many followers and supporters of the new administration who say, look, you publicly said during the campaign, and we believe that the United States has been scarred publicly by its apparent departure from the rule of law. How do we have a clear demarcation without looking back, an independent commission for perhaps looking carefully at it, and then moving ahead on a different track?
Sure. I think you're right. The key is, as I was saying, you do have to look back. And in order to understand where you stand today, you have to look at where you've come from. before. And that must happen, and I'm sure that it will happen. There will be that kind of investigation, no doubt about it. My point that's very important, however, is also that we have to move to a point beyond where we're saying, let's always find ways to cast blame on people, which indeed we will. We'll have to lay blame at people who are responsible. But we have to also say, how do we signal that this was unacceptable in the past, but most importantly, that we're going to go forward in the future with a much better policy?
Justice Finero, Guantanamo. The president has said it will be closed. However, those who were expecting that he was going to close it on the 21st of January were very disappointed. How big a problem? One of the things that Mike Chertoff told us was, you've got these people here who cannot go elsewhere. You don't want to release them on the streets of Newark. You can't try them because either their evidence was obtained unlawfully or because you don't have evidence that will hold up, and yet you think they're a danger. And then there are the people who have just no place to go, whether they were innocent or guilty. What do you think this president can do?
Well, I think he can close Guantanamo. He said he would do that. He campaigned on that.
And what does he do with the detainees?
That is a very...
250 left there, all of whom probably present some sort of problem.
Well, it's what I alluded to earlier. It's a complicated issue, and I think the president deserves time to work through those issues in a deliberate fashion. He seems to be doing that. I'm pleased that he has surrounded himself throughout his cabinet and sub-cabinet with extremely competent and experienced individuals. I wish Professor Alexander were one of them, because I think very highly of him as well. And we should not expect the president to have all the answers on day one. He needs some time, he needs to deliberate, he needs to consult, and he needs to make smart choices, not hasty choices. And as the professor just said, he needs to set the right policy. He is doing that, and frankly, I think he deserves our support, and he deserves a little leeway here in terms of timing.
Let me turn, Professor Alexander, to a new area, obviously not new to the country, immigration. You had a situation where the last administration's efforts to pass comprehensive legislation foundered before the campaign. And you did, however, have a considered policy of use of significant Department of Justice resources to prosecute illegal immigrants, an emphasis now on e-verification, where thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands of employers will be expected to participate in the enforcement aspect of immigration and the use of illegal workers. In terms of immigration reform and legislation and enforcement, do you think that the Obama administration is going to look much different from the Bush administration in its emphasis?
Well, I'm optimistic that what is going to happen in the Obama administration is that when we deal with immigration, that President Obama is going to be able to build the coalitions necessary to bring about significant reform. That is something which he talked about throughout the campaign, that part of the problem with immigration reform is there are a lot of different perspectives that cut across different regional alliances, party alliances, and the like. And getting it done has not been possible in the climate that exists in Washington. So I think the first priority is to find a way to find the common ground for the things that people want to believe on, so that we can then move forward with doing things that will fundamentally ensure a fair system, a system that works with some greater efficiency.
But let me see if I can nail you down just a little bit. I agree with the justice, and I think we all do, that it's complex and the president may have to move step by step. But there was a broad difference of opinion between those who are more or less said, let's look at the wall, let's look at enforcement, let's be aggressive in our dealing with immigration issues, and others who argued for a more comprehensive approach, and the dirty word amnesty popped up from time to time. On which of those vectors do you think the administration is likely to move as it tries to resolve these complex and thorny issues that revolve around the law as it touches on immigration?
Well, I guess, first of all, I might reject the premise, in a sense here, that you're saying that you have to choose one of the vectors. I think what we're looking at, that on the campaign trail, Barack Obama talked about a system where we would have certain priorities, for example, keeping families together as a priority, but also priority to say that those who are here in the country illegally, for example, that there should be some responsibility for the fact that they are here illegally, but that should not preclude the opportunity to, in a sense, get in the back of the line and file papers to try to get into the country to establish themselves legally here. So there's, I think, a lot of places where we can go where we'll see there's going to be much more agreement than saying it's simply a question of tougher enforcement versus different rules. I think that both of those, those different vectors you're talking about, I think there's a lot more agreement than people realize because of the debate that's happened in the past.
I also think that we have to keep in mind that the president is the head of one branch, an important branch, but there are other two branches of government. And
I
Congress.
Didn't know there was so in the Bush administration.
Well,
there's only one.
You know, it's very interesting how that debate sometimes
And in fact, the Congress
plays
didn't
out.
get on board with the last president on this subject.
That's right. And so as the new president sets his agenda, he is going to have to consult with Congress. Hopefully he will do that on a bipartisan basis, but just dealing with his own party is going to be a great challenge because I suspect that there are divisions among his own Democratic Party, and his agenda, however strongly he feels about it, is going to be influenced by what he believes Congress will adopt and how much political capital he wishes to expend.
Let me go back to my vector metaphor. Do you agree at the end of the day that people will not be able to characterize the Obama approach as either being primarily focused on tough enforcement or primarily focused on other aspects of immigration, that it will be the kind of mixture that Professor Alexander suggests?
I do. I think on a lot of these complex issues, if we're really going to find a smart consensus solution, there's not going to be a black or white, cut and dry response.
And Professor Alexander, speaking of areas where there's going to have to be input from the other branches of government, don't ask, don't tell. It almost toppled the Clinton administration in its first year. The president has now indicated that it's time for the military to let this go. We saw when Clinton tried to do it that there was outcry from the brass, and also Congress was not happy about it. Congress will have to play some sort of part in this. Where do you see this going? Is this perhaps a sop thrown to the gay voter that isn't going to actually translate into new rules?
I think that there's a couple of principles at work here. First of all, as a candidate, Barack Obama constantly talked about the need to recognize the equality of everybody in this country, and an equality that's based on, we won't want to separate people based on race or gender, sexual orientation, religion. There's a lot of ways in which our country is fundamentally, of course, built on notions of equality, but fundamentally better because of our commitment to equality. So I think you've got that in the first place. On the other hand, or not, I shouldn't say the other hand, just another point to throw into here is that Barack Obama has always demonstrated an extraordinary commitment to the men and women who wear our uniform and understanding their own humanity, which is very important to understand them as individuals who sacrifice their time and unfortunately sometimes their lives on behalf of the country.
Right, and you know that the brass said to Bill Clinton, because of that, you can't have openly gay people in the military, which is how we came to Don't Ask, Don't Tell. Can President Obama get rid of Don't Ask, Don't Tell and have everybody, sexual orientation notwithstanding, on an equal basis?
Well, obviously, he's going to have to figure out how to deal with the specific policy. That's his decision. I'd give a shout out also to a New Jersey resident, Jay Johnson, who's going to be his counsel at the Department of Defense, who can work on those specific kinds of regulations. It will be a challenge given the history and the culture of the military and where we've been before Don't Ask, Don't Tell, but I am certain that the president is committed to equality and to having everybody serve in an equal basis. And I think he'll find ways to move forward there.
If the president were to venture down the road of moving past Don't Ask, Don't Tell, do you think there'd be a strong congressional response?
There could be, and it could be an issue that he just may not want to deal with right now. Again, it goes back to an earlier point. This is going to be about priorities, and this is going to be about using the great goodwill and the political capital that he rightly deserves, but to use it in a way that will deal with the big issues first, the issues that he must deal with, the economy, domestic security, national security, foreign policy. Not to say these other issues aren't important, they are. But he has to govern smartly and use his capital wisely, in my view.
Well, let me address what I call a silent priority. The place you and I are most likely to see each other is in Seton Hall or around in Newark. And in the community, there are lots of folks who continuously say, we're about to lose another generation of young black males to drugs and to incarceration and other issues. While the president didn't talk about it during the campaign, there was the sense among his supporters that he cared about that issue and that question. Are we likely to see a direct frontal assault on that issue coming out of the White House in terms of legislation or change in policies in the early days of this administration?
I think there's no doubt there are several pieces that may come to bear on that. First of all, he has committed himself to an approach to cities, to America's cities, recognizing their greatness and having an Office of Urban Affairs within the White House with somebody specifically responsible directly to the president. So there's going to be no doubt a direct emphasis on what we can do in our nation's cities. I think also in terms of specifically speaking to particularly the young black men of our cities and young black men of our country, Barack Obama has been very clear as a role model in saying that there's not necessarily only one way to be, you have to be one way or another way, but he's been showing that there's a way in which we can all be better and we can all do better for ourselves. And to the extent that some are falling prey to drugs and working in, spending their time in gangs, not getting quality education, all these are pieces which Barack Obama has committed himself to helping improve from the earliest days of his professional career when he finished college working in Chicago, throughout his days in the state Senate, through as a United States Senator, now as president. I'm sure it will be an important priority, and doing things throughout the nation, of course, here in New Jersey. You mentioned Newark, working with people like Mayor Cory Booker to try to address the problems that fundamentally attack our communities, and I think there'll be a great presidency in that regard.
But, Professor, if going beyond the role model effect, which we hope will have a say, at least among some young people. If you're talking about active intervention, are you talking about programs that cost money? And when the new president says, hey, some of the things that I wanted to do are going to have to go on the back burner, is this one of them? And for us in a place like Newark, how serious is that?
I think absolutely right. I think my point is not that it's about being a role model. That is one part of it. But indeed, because of his commitment to our cities, through the Office of Urban Affairs in the White House, because of his commitment to programs like the COPS program and expanding it, those things will be very important. Obviously, the number one challenge is getting the economy to a place where we can afford to expand some programs that will be helpful. So finding the money is going to be a big challenge, but he has an absolute commitment to bringing about the change in our cities, dealing with drugs, dealing with gangs, because he knows that is a fundamental piece of how we move forward as a better society.
Actually, Sandy, in treating drug offenders rather than being quick to incarcerate them, you actually save money. And I think it's a good program not only because of the social benefits to it, but also financial benefits. The new president can learn, I think, from New Jersey's very good experiences with so-called drug courts, which is nonviolent drug offenders are put into mandatory treatment centers, are sentenced to treatment facilities rather than to prison. And the Whitman administration, and when I was Attorney General, we were really in the forefront of this idea. We caught some resistance from the so-called law and order folks.
Either of the federal political branches are moving in that direction? Do you have a sense of that?
I don't have a sense because I'm not as in tune to it as I was in New Jersey, but they should have a sense of it. And this is the kind of change that makes sense both as a matter of social policy but also financial policy. So this is one where I think it would fit into an urgent priority for the new president to consider alternative sentences and alternative criminal justice processes to solve not only the problem of drugs but also to cure those who are addicted and to reduce crime in the process.
But I wonder, both of you, whether there's a larger question here, and that is whether this president might actually abandon that war on drugs that Richard Nixon brought us in the early 70s, that we're still fighting with limited or some say no success. Professor Alexander, you know the new president. Do you think that he might actually break with that old policy and that could actually be a savings?
I think that there's no doubt that we have to constantly attack the sources in which drugs enter the country, work on how drugs move around the country, attack the gang mentality that does it. You can't stop trying to eradicate drug dealing and drug use, but clearly what you also have to do is you have to look at the root causes, and you have to say what is going on here in our communities where so many people are turning to drugs. And you have to do things like the drug courts, absolutely, great programs. You have to find ways to empower people economically, education. All these are pieces that get to the basic problem of why people are so addicted to drugs in so many of our communities, why we have so many problems. So you have to deal with both the front end, in a sense, the cause, and the effect, the
We
back
have to
end.
deal with only having 30 seconds left.
Sure.
So let me ask you, and then ask Justice Finero, 4 years from now, when we look at the justice picture, will America look different?
America will look like a much better place, absolutely committed to the rule of law, committed to fair and firm prosecution of people who violate the law, a beacon for the world, I believe.
Thanks. Last word, Justice Finero.
I hope all of those things happen. I think we'll have to wait and see. I think the...
Optimistic or not?
I am optimistic.
We're glad to hear that. We'll have to come back in 4 years and see what's happened. With our thanks to Professor Mark Alexander and to former Justice Peter Venero. That's it for this Due Process, but please be sure to join us next week for more on law and justice. Till then, for Sandy and all of us here, I'm Raymond Brown. Thanks for watching.
We know the challenges that tomorrow will bring are the greatest of our lifetime. 2 wars, a planet in peril, the worst financial crisis in a century. There are mothers and fathers who will lie awake after their children fall asleep and wonder how they'll make the mortgage, or pay their doctor's bills, or save enough for their child's college education. There's new energy to harness, new jobs to be created, new schools to build, and threats to meet, alliances to repair. The road ahead will be long. Our climb will be steep. We may not get there in 1 year or even in 1 term. But America, I have never been more hopeful than I am tonight that we will get there. I promise you, we as a people will get there.
Major funding for Due Process provided by the New Jersey State Bar Foundation, committed to educating the public about the law, and by the Fund for New Jersey, supporting informed citizens for an effective democracy.